for that.
So, we made it through another storm. It was like February, wasn't it? In April. We have to recognize that as the world unfolds for the next 2 decades, it's never going to be what we thought it was going to be. What I'd like to do today is continue our exploration of other faith traditions. A little while ago I talked about the perennial philosophy, and then we talked about the blending of the Hebrew and Christian traditions in what we call Palm Sunday. And today we're going to be honoring a very important holy day that's coming up this week on the 13th in the Islamic tradition. And it's a day that appeals to the mystics and to the adventurers in every tradition. So it's been about 500 years since the man that we call Mohammed the Prophet was on the earth and was receiving the messages that he was receiving. He was living in a time and a place. The Roman Empire was essentially gone by 600 AD, but there was still remnants. It was kind of weird. There was still a sense of the Romans were somehow affecting everything. And he lived in the area we call Mecca today. And in that area, they had a long tradition of appreciating a very, very miraculous well. And the well was called Zamzam. That well was the source of life for all the people around them. And because of its miraculous story of having come into being because someone prayed for it, the spiritual life of the many tribes around that region was centered around that well. And there was a large chapel, essentially, built, we call it the Kaaba. And in that Kaaba, there were sometimes as many as 350 different idols, different statues that were being honored as representations of the divine by the various tribes around the area. And the whole town of Mecca, kind of like Florence, depended on the tourists coming to honor those statues. And that was what made the residents of Mecca quite wealthy. The fact that they had the water and they had this Kaaba with all these wonderful statues. Well, somehow, in the midst of all of that, there were a few people who were familiar with the Judeo-Christian tradition and were also familiar with the Greek tradition, the Hellenic tradition. The Romans had just taken over the Greek Empire, so the Greek influence was still there over the several hundred years prior to this. And this tradition is that there are all these beings that we call gods, but the real power lies in the one unnamed, unknowable divinity that we all have access to. And that tradition was taught by some of the Greek philosophers from about 400 BC to about 480, and was alive and well among a few individual residents of Mecca. And one of those was a young herdsman who had been out into the desert and back many times on long journeys and had felt the power and the presence in the deep, dark nights. And so he connected with one of his uncles, who was one of the teachers of this idea of the unnameable, unknowable one God. And he felt like this was how it worked. And yet his community was, devoted to supporting everybody's belief in all of these statues in the Kaaba. So, as was traditional during that time, the month of Ramadan was a time when all adult males were invited to pray and fast. And he had a cave that he liked to go to. So Muhammad went off every morning at early pre-dawn to his cave, and he would pray and he would fast and he would try to get in touch with this unnameable, unknowable one beingness one day, his cave filled with light. And a being that he called Jibril, and we call Gabriel, filled the space and said, "Read. In the name of God, read." And he says, "I can't read. I can't write. Nobody taught me any of those skills." And the voice and the presence still came back with, "Read. Bismillah." Bismillah is another way to say it. Read. In the name of God, read. And what happened was that there were letters in the sky, and there was the voice telling him 5 verses. And the opening verse was, "There is one and only one." And Muhammad went into a state of shock. And instead of staying for the whole day, he ran home to his wife, who could read and write. She was a little older than he was and had grown up in a slightly different notion of how life could be lived. And she wrote down what he said. And she said, "This is very important." He says, "I must be going mad." And she said, "No, no, no, it's okay. You can go back tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow." So right about 6:10, this process that lasted until just before he died in 6:32 continued, of Muhammad going into prayer and being given these very clear, definitive statements, coming back, reciting those word for word to his community, someone writing them down. And so we have the surahs that make up the Quran, which, however, are not in order of his experience. These first 5 verses are in Surah 96. And the first several surahs are other people's commentaries on what is coming. So if you've ever read the Quran, the first basically 2 chapters are later people saying, "This is important, you need to read this," for what that's worth. So as life unfolded for Muhammad, the merchants who were dependent on people coming to worship the idols for their income were not happy that this guy was promoting, and people were getting very enthusiastic about there is only one, and it's unknowable and unnameable, and you can't have any idols. So they started giving him a really bad time. And they started giving his followers a really bad time. And it's a really awful bad time. There is a wonderful movie in which Anthony Hopkins plays Muhammad's uncle. And there is one rule in all of this, and that is, because you can't have an idol, you can't have a face for Muhammad. So if you've, in the movie, everything is from his eyes. You never see the actor. You hear the voice, but you never see the actor. You only see what he's seeing. It's very interesting if you get a chance to see The Prophet with Anthony Quinn. So as you experience this, as people experience this, they felt the intensity and the possibility of it, and then they're getting these merchants saying, "No, no, 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 this can't be how it is, this can't be how it is." And finally, after a number of years, they end up leaving the Mecca area, and they move into a Jewish community, Zataf, because they can get it. And that place becomes renamed, and we call it Medina or Medina today. So they moved. Well, now they are not at this miraculous place, the Zamzam well and this Kaaba, and so they don't have a center, a thing that was, caused them to feel like they were connected with the divine. They have to somehow, somewhere else, make that connection. It's kind of like when the Jews couldn't have the temple anymore, right? When the Hebrew people were banished from the temple and they had to find, how can we experience God's presence without the temple? The same kind of thing happened for Muhammad and his followers. How do we experience the presence of the divine without the Kaaba? So that's part of the reason that everyone has to go back and experience the Kaaba as part of, and that's the Hajj. in the Muslim tradition. Well, after a number of years of being not only acclaimed as a prophet, but now acclaimed as a leader of many people and communities, and as you know, the person that made all the decisions for everybody, because that's how it's done in the Arab culture. Muhammad was once again, it wasn't Ramadan, but he was once again in a prayerful state. And he went to a place that was a place of prayer, okay, and it has a name. It's Midaj, or Miraj, depending on how you pronounce it. It's R, but in some Arabic tongues the R comes out more like a D. Right? Miraj, you can remember it as Miraj, because in this time and in this place, on this particular night, he was doing his normal prayer, and suddenly he was aware that there was a horse there. Now this is not any normal horse. This is a very unusual horse. This is a horse with the head of a female. This is the horse of the prophets. This is the horse that carries the prophets. And with the horse, Gabriel has shown up again. And he is saying, it's time for you to move on to the next level of your being, of your experience. And so he mounts the horse, and you have seen images of this, but probably didn't register it. And I have one in my living room, those of you who come to groups in my living room. It's a person with a veil over her face, you don't know, riding this horse with a female head. And this is the story of what's being commemorated on April 13. He gets on the horse, and he is taken to the spot that in the Jewish tradition is where Abraham and Isaac, Abraham has been asked to sacrifice Isaac to God, and then at the last moment, an angel shows up and a goat is substituted as the sacrifice. Well, that rock is where David had chosen to build the temple of, that is the cornerstone of that experience, and has been rebuilt and rebuilt and demolished and rebuilt. So he's on this rock, which is the cornerstone of the Jewish temple, and here he feels that connection, because a lot of the Quran was explaining the whole Hebrew tradition and some of the Christian stuff. There are stories about Jesus and Mary and Joseph, and stories about Moses and Abraham, and all these people in the Quran that are really wonderful, and they were revelations given to Muhammad in his prayer. So he's there and he feels this connection with the father of everyone, because Abraham had sons, and one became the Arabs and one became the Hebrews. All right? And so Ishmael became the father of the Arabs, Ishmael and all of that tradition, and back to Abraham. And he feels that. And in that moment, a ladder appears, Ishbar, ladder. And he feels himself lifted up this ladder, anything like Jacob, right? Jacob's ladder. And so he's feeling himself carried up this ladder, and he comes to the 7 prophets, the heavens in which each of the prophets live. All right? So the horse and the ladder and all of this all become part of the story, and he actually, depending on who's telling the story, you get more and more detail about each of the prophets. The simple version is he just gets to meet each of the prophets. The lengthy version is we find out how tall they are, what color skin and hair they have, and all of this. From Abraham all the way through Moses and Elijah and all these people, all the way to Jesus and John the Baptist. Okay? But it starts the other way. He starts with Jesus and John the Baptist. That's the most recent. And he works back through history, and the last one is Abraham. And then Gabriel says, I can't go any further. You must go the next step alone. And he is at the gate of the throne of God, the unknowable, unnameable Allah. And he, with great humility and some trepidation, moves into that space, and he ends up having, depending on the story, a really wonderful conversation with this being. And in some stories, God condescends to show up as a human being so they can talk and touch and all of that. In other versions of the story, he's just overwhelmed with this flood of knowing and understanding. But one of the things that he is told in this incredible experience is how to tell his people how to carry forward and feel this connection and be able to move into this same oneness and connection and communication with the divine. And Mohammed hears God saying they must pray 50 times a day. Oh my goodness. So he goes back down through the heavens. He gets to Moses, Musa. And Moses says, oh, no, 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 no. Let me tell you, they're never going to do that. He says, you go back, you negotiate. So he goes back. He says, Moses tells me they're not going to do this. What do I do? And God says, well, 30. We can do it with 30. He goes back. Moses says, oh, no, 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 no. Not happening. So he goes back 7 times. He's been through 7 heavens, 7 prophets, and he's going back to God 7 times to negotiate how often people have to pray in order to get into communion with God. And finally God says 5 times. Moses goes back. Muhammad goes back to Moses, and Moses says, I don't think so. Muhammad says, I can't do it again. And so the tradition is that he comes back through all of the prophets, and each one of them gives him his blessing. And Gabriel says, now you are one of the prophets. You are blessed in this way, in the same way. And he returns to the rock and then back to the place of prayer in Medina and shares his experience. So this is what is being celebrated on April 13th, is the recognition that this being, this man who devoted his life and then lived through all kinds of trials and tribulations, including being in charge of people when he didn't feel like he was capable of it, had this miraculous experience. And then he went on to live for another 12, 15 years and teaching people how to do this. So this is the night of the miracle. So what's interesting is it turns out in the Hebrew tradition, it's recommended to pray 5 times a day. But Moses knew people weren't going to do this, and so 3 times a day is sufficient, and morning and evening is necessary. And Muhammad, established this tradition of 5 times a day, and anyone who has been in any of the Arabic countries, any of the Islamic countries, knows that you're going to hear 5 times a day the call to prayer. And sometimes it's just, and sometimes it's getting down and getting on one's knees in an isolated place, if not in a mosque. So, for those of us who have wondered why there is a mosque on the Temple Mount, you now know. This is what it's about. So, over the next couple of 100 years, the people who had followed Muhammad started expanding and inviting more and more people, and they had several rules, and one of them was, if you were a person of the book, if you were Hebrew, Jewish, Christian, if you were one of the heretical sects of Christianity, if you were people of the book, we won't bother you. We know that you're worshiping the same God we're worshiping, and it's okay. Unless you attack us, in which case you will get the wrath of God through us. Okay? But as long as you just keep doing your thing, that's cool. And what that meant, and then they would, thousands of them would show up at a city and they'd say, okay, who's with us? And everyone who was with us was left in peace. Who's against us? They'd wipe them out. And they managed to cover, in less than 200 years, the whole Mediterranean region, except for certain parts of Italy and France. And by 300 years, they had the whole Mediterranean completely surrounded and completely Islamized. brought into Islam, brought into the people of peace. Is means people, salam means peace. And that's what they were aiming for. And because they did that, and because they maintained the Hellenic traditions and the Hellenic writings, the Greek writings and the Roman writings, in southern Spain, southern France, and around the edges of the Mediterranean, science continued to build on those things. Mathematics continued to build on those things. Philosophy and arts continued to build on those things. As long as they didn't portray a being, they would continue to expand in those areas. And it meant that come about 900 AD, there were better educated people around the Mediterranean than anywhere else in that part of the world, in the ancient Greek and Roman and westernized sciences. And those traditions then began to filter northward into Europe through the fact that the Muslims had kept them and continued to study them. And it's not an accident that we use Arabic numerals in our counting system, because it had pretty much died out, any kind of numbering, writing of numbers anywhere else. So part of the importance of this story and part of the intriguing nature of the timing this year, it isn't always in the spring that we get to experience this holiday, because the Islamic calendar is a lunar calendar, so it kind of rotates around our solar calendar. But this is the season in the Christian tradition where we are preparing for Jesus' ascension. Okay? So Muhammad's journey to God is called his ascension. Jesus' ascension is a very different experience. And in 40 days after Easter, so that'll be right about May 15, we will be seeing in the Christian tradition people saying, Jesus has ascended. He has ascended to sit at the right hand of God. Right? And Islam doesn't consider that as part of Jesus' experience. In Islam, Jesus is just a very powerful prophet able to work miracles. As they all were, all of them. So the ascension in the Christian idea is saying that it's possible for someone who to overcome death. That was what Easter was about. We don't have to go through the death process, and then to, in our bodies, ascend into heaven without going through the death process again. And Jesus insisted anything he could do, we could do better. So it's something that's been offered to all people, all times, everywhere. And occasionally, there have been people willing to pick up on it and attempt it. And so we have an interesting history of one guy in particular, who's known as an alchemist, who in Europe was part of the court of King James and was hanging out with Shakespeare, but also appears to have been part of the court of King Louis in the 1700s and 1800s, and may have been, according to some stories, the guy who persuaded everyone to sign the Declaration of Independence. He's known as the Comte de Saint-Germain, and some people call him Saint Germain, but he was a count of the province of Saint-Germain, and he practiced alchemy. He practiced the process of transforming the body-mind system and the world around us, which in the mystery schools is what Jesus was doing also. It was not part of the Muslim heritage to go there. So Islam doesn't include that. There is only one being who ascended, and that was that one night, April 13th, in Islam. But around the edges have been the mystery schools. And in the mystery schools, there are the processes of getting so you can read, and you can write, and you can speak, and you can do poetry, and you can do arithmetic, and you can do geometry, and you can measure the stars and all of that. That's the liberal arts. Then the master's degree is astrology. As above, so below, it's all the same. And then the doctorate is alchemy. Transform self, transform the world. The Comte de Saint-Germain appears to have been active in Europe and to some extent in the Americas for over 200 years, looking in his 30s. And there are tales and all kinds of documentation that you can accept or not. In the Tibetan tradition, ascension is considered normal, and in the Kriya Yoga tradition, ascension is considered normal. In both of these traditions, at some point, the transformation of the inner leads to the transformation of the body, which means the body can stay in this dimension or enter any other dimensions at will. And remain one, look at the prime of that body's life. So it might be 40, might be 30, might be 18. Babaji, the ancient Babaji, Mahababaji, is one of those who continues to show up in people's lives looking 18, and he was born in 1400 something. I happen to have a friend who studied with the Tibetan Lamas for 30 years, and he was present when his meditation teacher, who was also the Dalai Lama's meditation teacher, chose to leave the planet. He was living in the south of France. His sons were mature enough to take over. There is one lineage of lamas where you have children. And his sons were ready to take over for him. And so he went back into his meditation room, and he began to meditate. And 3 weeks later, he was still sitting there. His body was still warm, but it was beginning to shrink. And as soon as they registered that was what was going on, they began the preparations because they know how to do this. This is part of the Tibetan tradition. So they prepared this beautiful box, filled it with salt, and when the body was this tall, in lotus position, they picked it up and they placed it in this box. And they carried this box, completely filled it with salt around the body, carried this box to Nepal because it can't be in Tibet. And someone had already begun, 10 years before, creating the temple. And the temple has a glass case. And Dudjom Rinpoche's body is incorrupted, sitting in this glass case at that height. Now, Dudjom has had 150 students who, in meditation, chose not to shrink their bodies or not to die, but simply to leave behind their robes, their hair, and their fingernails. Because the hair and the fingernails are not alive. Right? So you come into the meditation chamber after days or weeks, and all you see is the fingernails and the hair on the robes. 150 students chose to be able to move across the dimensions rather than go through death. Isn't that interesting? Anything they can do, we can do.
Better.
Hopefully better. What's missing in our lives are these stories. Most of you have never heard any of this, right? And I only started hearing it 20 years ago. You know, it just happens I study this stuff, right? But, wow, how could we possibly do it if we can't even be aware that it's available to us, right? Wow. So Mohammed went on a journey, a one-night journey, that demonstrated in Islam it was possible for a prophet to transmute and be transmitted from this set of dimensions to the heavenly set of dimensions. The Christian tradition says, well, one guy pulled it off. The Tibetan Buddhists say, learn how. It's your choice. There is a wonderful, marvelous little book, the 18 Kriya Yoga City Tradition. And in it, it talks about 18 people who, when it was time for them to leave, there would be a sudden flash and sometimes some smoke. And that'll be it. They're gone. In documented situations throughout India. Most of them were in the Tamil parts, the original Indian people down in the southern parts of the country. It's here. It's an option. Oh, there is another way to look at this word ascension. And that means to rise from one level of consciousness to another level of consciousness. To no longer live as animals or as intellectual beings, but to live as spiritual beings. It doesn't have to be a physical ascension. But as we begin to make that shift from being either totally physical or totally mental, or into something that integrates the physical and the mental and allows the spiritual. Wayne Dyer used to say we're spiritual beings having a human experience. If we consider that possibility, one of the ways to look at what's happening to humanity today is we are being encouraged, invited to ascend. To ascend from relying totally on our intellects for our well-being and the well-being of those around us. To recognizing that there is something in us and around us that has more power and more capability, that gives us more power and more capability than we've ever experienced. That's what the 150-year-old New Thought tradition has been about, and it's what the core of every spiritual tradition, when I talked about the perennial philosophy, it's what that core is inviting everyone to do. Find that place beyond the realm of intellect, beyond the realm of distinction and difference, where creative energy and unfolding is the nature of things, and where we are all one, and we are all living love forever. Thank you very much.